Hey everybody, welcome back. So this week we are talking about selection. So we've already talked about the first step of HR, which is recruitment. How do you get together a pool of candidates? Excuse me, just want to get a keyboard cover. Okay, so the first question is how do you get a pool of candidates that want the job? And that's the object of recruitment, and we talked about the job analysis, the job description, the job specification, and then I think there were 9 steps in the plan of environmental scanning and looking at the statistics of the local area to see what labor is available, targeting diversity, writing advertisements, deciding whether you're using internal versus external recruitment, all that stuff. Now we get to the next topic, which is selection. So now let's say that you have this group of people who want the job. Now, how do you decide who do you select? So now you've done all your advertisements, you did your job analysis, you searched the labor pool, you put out the advertisements, and you have 100 people who want this job. So great. Now, how do you choose the right person? And that is the topic of selecting. So some of the stuff, again, we're going to do in class, like the presentation we'll do in class. Carter Cleaning Company will do in class. And what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about, we could talk about this for a second. So imagine you're facing a project deadline and you can't finish the project on time. And it's really important that you complete the project on time. So you're not going to be able to. It's just a no-win situation, what the Japanese called a Kobayashi Maru, just a no-win situation. What do you do? And that's a really important kind of question that we might ask in one of our selection criteria or tests. So do you ask for an extension? Do you let the supervisor know? Do you work as many hours as it takes? Do you try to explore different ways? Do you just hand in what you have so far? Do you just do the critical parts and don't do the other parts? Do you tell the supervisor you're angry and the deadline is unrealistic? I'm afraid I would do that one. Do you give the supervisor an update and express concerns about your ability to finish the job, or do you quit? There is no right answer to these things, but they tell you a lot about a person's character or about how somebody would work. And so that's really important when we're selecting people. So let's start by talking about some basic concepts in testing, and particularly what's called validity and reliability. And those two are very important when you do go on to write your thesis papers. With whatever kind of research you do, you're going to have to deal with these topics of validity and reliability for primary research. Why am I eating a candy while I'm talking? I don't know. Okay, so testing. Testing became really popular after 1945. And the reason it became so popular was during World War II, there were tens of thousands of new military recruits. And the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, they had to decide, okay, we have all these new people. Who does what? Who is suitable to be a linguist or a code breaker or a frontline artillery person, or who should study flying and become a pilot, or who should go into resource management? There's lots and lots of resources that need to be distributed throughout the military branches of the government. And so this field of testing people became really, really popular. In around the 1990s, it started to become less popular. There was an idea that testing was inherently unfair. And this idea that we should all be equal, it's not fair to, if you want to learn something, maybe that's what you should be allowed to learn. It shouldn't be about what the managers think you're suited for. It should be about, trying to work with what you want to do. And now in, the 2010s, it's really come back after the year 2000 in importance, if not popularity, because with the global economy now, you can hire people from anywhere. You can have your advertising team have one person in France and one in Russia and one in Canada. And so because there's so much availability, this is just like 1945 again, where you have all of these thousands of possible recruits. You know, in the past, of course, if you advertised for a job, only people in that area were applying. Now you advertise for a job, you might have thousands of people around the world. And there's also more security concerns about choosing the right kind of person because data is so sensitive these days. And there is, you know, increasingly a shortage of skilled labor. You do have more and more people going to university, but people are very specialized. So why is it so important to choose the right person? So obviously, if you have the right people for the job, you're going to have better performance. You'll have better performance both for the employees and for the organization. And for the managers, because if I'm a manager, my performance may be measured by how my employees do or how my department does. Also, if I screen people, and screening, by the way, it's really sunny where I am, so it might be kind of really sunny, but that's okay. Screening, which is another way to say testing, right? Like you have a screen and not everybody gets through. It can reduce dysfunctional, which is the opposite of functional behaviors. So all of these antisocial workplace behaviors that we've talked about in the past, and I talk about that more in organizational behavior, but there's a lot of dysfunctional work behaviors that could go anywhere from positive and proactive, like going and talking to the boss. That's, you know, it's not functional. It means there's a problem, but it's a healthy way to deal with it, to something that's negative and passive, such as showing up late for work or not coming in or taking a really long lunchtime. You know, those things really slow down efficiency, and nobody's telling the boss that they're unhappy. They're just being passive and negative. There's active negative workplace behaviors such as throwing things, pushing people, being rude to people on the telephone or rude to customers. You know, all of these behaviors can absolutely kill a company's productivity. It's really important to have the right people. And it is very, very expensive to do this whole process of recruiting we talked about and then hire new people. And so a lot of the expense is in productivity lost. So you have people in your company who need to spend time doing a job analysis or meeting with all the employees to interview them, to find a job description and a job specification. This just takes tens of hours that they could be doing other things. So it's quite important to select people properly. Also, there are some legal ramifications or implications to hiring the wrong person. Because if you hire someone carelessly, whether it's because of what they look like or their relationship to you, that can actually be a case, a law case, where people can sue you for negligent, which means careless, for careless hiring, that you hired the wrong person because of they were your cousin or because you found this person attractive or, you know, for whatever reason. So we want to very carefully scrutinize who we hire. We want to have background checks on people. We want to make sure we save all records in case it comes out in court. We want to make sure that when people make statements to us about previous jobs, that they are true. We want to vet them. And I used this word before, V-E-T-T. So to vet someone is to make sure that they're telling the truth. And so you would call their previous employers or you would call their previous schools or something to make sure they're telling the truth. And then if there are disciplinary problems, you'd want to take care of this immediately. So with negligent hiring, we already talked about the laws. That was our second week. And we talked about equal opportunity laws, and we talked about Title VII and the EEOC, right? The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And so hiring cannot discriminate. We know that very well. You got to review that stuff because that'll all be on the midterm, which, by the way, I will talk about in our next class. So if an employee commits a criminal act, that actually may result in the employer being responsible. It depends on whether or not the employer was careful in who they hired. If I hire someone carelessly because I think this guy is cool and he's friend of a friend, and I say, yeah, man, come on, you know, you can work at my place, and then he commits a crime, If I had done my research and looked at his background, would I have reason to know that he might have committed that crime? If so, I, the boss, am responsible because I'm the one who hired him. So employers have this obligation to try to get relevant information about an employee, to verify everything they say, to verify their documents, to follow up if there's any missing records or gaps in employment. This is the responsibility of the boss. Okay, this is an actual positive responsibility that employers have. You have to carefully examine who you hire, because if you don't, you are responsible for their behavior. So if I hire you and then you're angry one day and a customer comes in and you punch the customer, I'm the one who's responsible for that as the boss, even though you punched him. Now, you're responsible too, but I'm probably going to be sued because I run a company. I have more money than you potentially. And so I'm going to be sued because maybe if I looked into this employee's background, I would see that he has had complaints against him for violence before. So how do we use testing to determine who is right for a job? Can we determine someone's academic success through a test? We certainly try. In America, we have the SAT. In China, they have the Gaokao. Every country really has their own test that tries to determine the success of a student. Now, does it work? We'll talk about this together in class, but when someone gets a good grade on the SAT, do all of the people who get good grades on the SAT end up rich? No, not really. Do they all end up happy? Not necessarily. What about students who get a high grade on the Gaokao? Does it mean they will be successful in life? No. Does it mean they'll be successful on tests? Maybe. These tests do determine academic success to some extent. But life success, future life success, these academic tests really, they're not even designed for that. Because we can design tests to determine different things. So if that's true, can we design a test to determine how well an employee will perform at work? That's what we want. We don't really care if an employee is good at memorizing, which is a big part of academic success. I had a friend who used to teach at Tsinghua, which is the sort of Harvard of China. And he said those students you could give them 100 pages a day and they could read it, they could memorize stuff, but it didn't really necessarily prepare them for every element of life. It prepared them for a very specific skill, which is doing a lot of work. There's an experiment called the Stanford Marshmallow experiment done by this guy, Professor Walter Mischel, in 1972. And this was an interesting experiment about delayed gratification. So he took little kids. They started with 32 kids. This has been done many times since. And they were aged 3 to about 6, so very young. And he did an experiment that you might have heard of where he tested delayed gratification. He offered each student one marshmallow or pretzel, whichever they preferred. And he said to the kids, you can have one marshmallow now, or if you wait 15 minutes, you can have 2. And this was just that. It was just an experiment on little kids to see about delayed gratification. And it's a really interesting story because one of the kids was his daughter, who was at that time maybe 4 years old. And when his daughter grew up and she was in college, she was talking about some of her good friends. And he remembered that a lot of these friends of hers were kids from her nursery school where he did the test on those kids. And he started asking her about, how are they doing? How are these kids doing now that they're in college or now that they're in their 20s? And he discovered something absolutely amazing, which was he realized that the kids who were doing well had, they were very in shape, they had good grades, they went to good colleges, or they got good jobs, they got married, they had healthy relationships, all of these different measurements of life success. The people who were doing well were the same people, the same kids who, when they were 4 or 5 years old, waited 15 minutes to eat that marshmallow. You know, they got 2 instead of 1. So he went back and he found all 32 people, and he did all of these interviews to find out how are their lives going. And he found out that, in fact, it almost matched exactly. The children who understood delayed gratification and were willing to wait for more, they had better life outcomes in every respect. Better body BMI, right? Was it basal metabolic inventory? Something like that, basal metabolic indicator. Anyway, the BMI is a measurement of, I think, your resting caloric rate, but just has to do with your health. Better SAT scores, better education, better jobs, less likely to go to jail, less likely to be addicted to drugs and alcohol, just everything they could pretty much test for. And this is, in fact, the only test we've ever really found that goes to overall life, that the children who understand delayed gratification tend to be more successful adults and happier. So this is kind of, if you want to read more about this, because it's very, very interesting, this would be the study of willpower. And that's what they call it. And there's very interesting books on it, a lot of fantastic tests, which we can talk about, you know, privately if you're interested. There are other tests we have, such as the Rorschach test. The Rorschach test is commonly used in job selection and in psychiatry. So let's talk about this when we get into class, but really the question is, you know, and I'm sure you've seen these somewhere, but the question is, what do these look like and what does that mean? Now, would it be reasonable for me to give you grades based on those? No, of course not. Depending on the class, but still probably no. Probably not. Right? I couldn't say, here's a picture of some ink, tell me what it looks like, and that determines your grade. So is there any way to make something like this valid? How is it possible to give you grades without tests? There are schools in America, I assume there are in other countries too, but in America there are schools that don't give tests, universities, and it's a lot of work. It's not easier. You know, the teacher has to write these long, critical reports about each student rather than just giving them a test. So it is possible to give grades without tests. Is it possible to hire the right people without tests? Well, you can certainly use intuition. This old idea that when someone walks in the room within the first minute, you can tell if you like them. And that's true. Studies have verified that. They call that, what is it called? Cold identification, cold determination. I forget the exact term, but it is possible, and that's the basis for most dating programs, like whatever it's Tinder or Match.com or whatever, you know, dating programs, because you're just looking at someone's picture, and yet studies have shown that just by seeing someone, you can tell with a certain level of accuracy whether you might get along with this person, having to do with a lot of micro signals. And when you're face to face and it's not just a static picture, that works even better. But just using intuition doesn't really tell us if an employee can do the job. So we use, you know, interviews. Sure, you sit down, you meet with somebody, you ask them questions, that certainly helps. Resumes, that certainly helps. You get an idea of this candidate's experience, what they've done in the past, also just the layout of the piece of paper and how they do it. You check their references and you call their previous employers. These 3 things, for most companies, this is what they use. They don't use anything else. However, because we're studying HR, we can get a little deeper than these 3 things, and we can understand that pre-employment and employment tests are really beneficial. Even if you could use resumes, interviews, and references, these tests can help a lot. So with pre-employment tests, one of the things we want to do is we want to look for negative traits. Because in an interview or on a resume, people can really sell themselves. And of course, if I give you a list of references and I'm going to curate or choose carefully who I want you to call. I'll give you this manager's phone number, but not that manager. So you know that they're going to say good things about me. No, I'm never going to give you the name of somebody who would give me a bad reference. So as an employer, you already know going into this process, in the interview, everybody's looking their best, trying to sell themselves. Their resume is tailored to sell themselves, and their references are curated to sell themselves. With pre-employment tests, we want to try to look for other negative traits to see, are there things we can parse out or find out that they didn't tell us about. And then the opposite of that, we want to identify some characteristics that match the job analysis or the job specification or the job description. We know what we're looking for. I mean, that's why it's so important to have the job analysis, job description, and job specification. If we don't know what we're looking for, then we're just going to choose somebody who seems smart, cool, nice, friendly. You know, these terms that are not necessarily really related to the job, especially if we're choosing people of a higher level, sort of an exempt job, like a manager position. Choosing someone who's friendly and nice and cool. Managers can't always be friendly and nice and cool. They have to sometimes punish people, yell at people, fire people. These are things they have to do. So we really want to know what characteristics we're looking for and then match the right candidate to the job. There are lots of kinds of tests that we could use. There are skills tests, aptitude also called, like the SAT, the Scholastic Aptitude Test. Aptitude is a kind of skill, and it could be a typing test to see how fast you type. I've taken up so many typing tests. God, after college, before I went to law school, I did, lots of different jobs that, some of them I liked. I worked in China for a while, but I also worked in different offices doing temporary work. I did that during summer vacations and stuff in school. And they used to always make you take typing tests for speed. I don't know if they still do that anymore. Other tests would be filing. I once did a filing test where they had a big filing cabinet and a big bunch of files, and they said, put these in order A to Z. And they just wanted to see how fast you do that. Can you do that? I mean, it's not the hardest thing in the world, but you kind of have to pay attention. I've done, in law too, I've done certain tests where you have to look at a document and decide, would this document be privileged? Which means if the other side requests it from us, this is all irrelevant, but if the other side requests the document, do you have to give it to them, or could you say, no, this is privileged information? So these are all different skills. They're not necessarily physical. Physical might be a strength test. It might be a dexterity test. It might be a flexibility test. It might be a balancing test for a waiter to see, can you balance 3 tables worth of dishes on one big platter? I've been a waiter. Those kind of things are hard if you're not used to it. You do not want to drop a bunch of glasses and dishes. Integrity tests, really important if we can find out the integrity of someone. Obviously, personality tests and psychology tests are what we usually think of, and that's where something like the Rorschach test, that ink blot test where there's a picture and you have to say what it looks like, those are psychological or personality tests, and we'll talk about those more during this lesson. We'll also have next week, I think, is our student presentation on a bunch of those different tests because they're really interesting and some of them are quite fun, but they're very useful to know about. Because most people who didn't study HR don't think about testing. They just think about interviews, resumes, and maybe background checks. And then drug and alcohol testing, more and more important. And it's also important to understand when we can and can't do that and what kind of tests are feasible, whether it's a urine test or a hair follicle test or anything like that. So generally, these are pre-employment. They're before we hire someone. We can also give people a test during the job, but what we're talking about now are pre-employment. So what are some of the uses of them? We want to predict on-the-job behavior. I think this should be acceptable, but we want to predict behavior. That's really our biggest goal here. We don't just want to hire someone who seems cool and then hope they're cool. We want to be able to predict, are they going to do a good job? We also want to minimize bias, because this idea of, and we'll talk about this more, I think not in this class, but maybe in the next class, or maybe later in this class when we talk about interviews. But there's so much bias in terms of how firm someone's handshake is, or how they look, if they're tall, if they have a full head of hair, how they're dressed, if they're beautiful, just all of these, if they smell good. There's so many biases. If they're from a racial background similar to us, how they speak, if they have an accent, if they speak clearly. There's so many things that can bias us. But giving people psychological tests, it doesn't matter what you look like. It's really about your answer. We also want to identify these negative traits, these unfit workers. We want to find out who would be responsible. We ultimately want to reduce costs because we don't want to hire people based on the fact that they seem cool and they have a good resume and they had a good interview and then have to fire them 6 months later and hire someone new and train them again. Also, we can give these to identify people who might be stars in the future. We want to protect against what we call professional applicants. These are these people I spoke of who have amazing interview skills, beautiful resume, amazing interview, great background checks, and they are so good at getting a job. Not good at doing a job and not good at keeping a job, but great at getting a job. These people we call professional applicants. And then maybe identify people who need additional training in the future. Some employers don't give tests. Some employers rather give tests before the interview. And if you don't pass those tests, you don't even get the interview. That, for example, is something that I think Apple and Google and a lot of those companies do, that they're going to give you a test, and if you don't pass the test, whether it's mathematics or coding or lateral logic. I had a friend who had interviewed for Apple, and before the interview, they called him up and asked 10 questions. You have 1 minute for each question, and they were logic questions. So I won't go into it now, but yeah, if somebody reminds me, I'll tell you the first of the logic questions. But there are these logic questions, and if you get all 10 right, 1 minute each, then you get the interview. Because for the interview, they'll fly you out to California and put you up in a hotel, and they're not just going to do that for everybody who has a nice resume. So they'll give you this pre-interview test. Other employers will give tests after the interviews, works in any way you want it. Then, as I said, there's also tests that are given once you have the job, and we call these employment tests. And so this is for employees who already work at the company, and they are used to identify people who could be promoted, or to find hidden skills, or again, to find negative traits that might be coming out. So these are often used in career planning because we want to figure out what KSAPs do people have and do people need. So we give them tests maybe before they get the job, but it could be every 6 months, every 3 months, every month, every year. We're also going to probably give tests to employees to see how they're doing. So just like pre-employment tests, these current employment tests also have their uses. We want to improve the employee to job match. Maybe somebody now has been working for us for a year and we find that they're not doing very well in the marketing department. Well, maybe we move them over to the advertising department or the R&D department or the recruiting department or H&R, whatever. We want to see where people could have greater efficiency. We want to use this for promotions. We talked in our last subject about promoting internally. Well, these tests help us to determine who could be promoted, to make sure employees understand job requirements, to deal with succession planning, which we talked about last class, to validate success of training. So we have training programs in any good company is going to have some kind of training programs, and we want to know if these are successful. So how do we determine if they're successful? We use tests. And to make sure we reduce favoritism. Right? Once somebody's been working in a company for a while, they might become friends with the boss, these in-groups and out-groups that tend to get formed. And there are different theories about that, but in order to reduce that, we can use tests that have a little bit more of an objective answer. So it doesn't matter how you feel about someone. We can talk, see there are a couple discussions we'll talk about in class. Let's jump forward to some advantages of testing. And we've already really talked about this now, the benefits and why we use testing, right? So I'm repeating this is important to match abilities to requirements, right? In our past subject, we talked about determining the requirements with the job description and determining what abilities we need and what kind of personality we need for each job with the job specification, and that these two together give us the job analysis. Now, in this subject, we have that information. Now we want to match the right person to the right job. We want to look for desirable traits, things that we can't necessarily learn from an interview or a resume, such as your honesty, your integrity, your emotional stability. We can't really learn that from your resume or from an interview, but we can learn some of these things from testing. We also want to look for undesirable traits, such as drug abuse, stealing, cheating, a lack of integrity. We want to do this to protect us against lawsuits for negligent hiring, which I already talked about. We want to be careful about who we hire. It's possible that if we can't do reference checks, if we cannot call your references, we can do this, give these tests instead. And it also can help us to distinguish between similar candidates, that's the word here, otherwise similar candidates. So if we have two people, they both went to the same good university, they both had similar backgrounds, they both had 3 years of postgraduate experience, how do we choose these two people? You know, one's a woman, one's a man, or one's black, one's white, or one's Latino and one is Jewish. I mean, how do we choose between people who have very similar academic backgrounds? And testing is one of these great ways to find out more about a person's personality. However, there are disadvantages to testing as well. So sometimes we use this as a substitute for good interview skills. Sometimes in a company, HR is not good at interviews, so they use tests instead, and it's not a substitute. It's meant to be used in addition to interviews. Tests, another problem is we're trying to predict who will do well, but sometimes we just predict who might do well, not who will. Some people don't like tests, and it really turns them off and makes them unhappy, and they don't want to work in that company. Some people are just bad at taking tests, and they're good employees, but they're bad at tests. Tests may be unnecessary, and they're commonly viewed as a sort of panacea or a solution, a cure-all, where they're not. They just help us determine a very specific thing. But as you see, the disadvantages are minor, very minor, compared to the very major advantages. Before we actually give someone a test, there are really 4 things we need to do, or 5 things rather. So first, we need the good job analysis from last week. We can't do a test if we don't know exactly what we're looking for. Then we need a good testing policy, and we'll talk a little about that in today's class. But a policy means we can't just have people show up and then give them a test. There needs to be a whole policy of how we're going to conduct the test and give the test and make it fair and explain the test. And then we need to make sure the test is valid and reliable. That's very important before we give it to people. We need to make sure that the people who give the test, HR department, that they are qualified to give a test. Not everybody is. If I show you a picture of ink and I say, okay, tell me what you see, I'm not necessarily qualified to determine what your answer means. If you say, oh, I think that looks like a butterfly, or I think that looks like an angel, or I think that looks like a killer stabbing his best friend. I mean, except maybe that last one, I don't know how to interpret these things. You know, so with different tests, sometimes, in fact, with a test, you actually need to bring in an expert, a psychologist, to give the test, somebody who does employment psychology. And so that's what I said about it being sunny. They can give the test. Also, test conditions must be fair. You cannot give a test to one group of people at 9 o'clock in the morning and it's nice and quiet, and then you give another test at 3 o'clock and there's construction outside and there's people screaming in the hallway and somebody brought their baby and he's crying, and that's not fair, and that is grounds for a lawsuit. And then you also want to make sure the tests are scored in a very fair way without any bias, which again might call for a professional test giver. So let's start by talking about, we already talked about job analysis. We'll talk about a testing policy later. Let's get into validity and reliability, which to me are probably the most important element of testing. And as I said, you'll see this in your thesis as well, talking about, is my survey valid and reliable? Are these interviews valid and reliable? Everything in terms of primary research has to be valid and reliable. So how do we make a picture like this valid and reliable? I mean, I can say, what do you see? And, I can tell you right now the common answers. I think let's wait for class to talk about that. But in this kind of test, are the results reliable? So what does that mean, reliable? We'll talk about that word first. Reliable asks this question: will someone get the same results if I give them the test today as if they took the test later? So let's say I give you a very simple math test, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and I give you the test today, and then I give you the test again in 3 weeks, and I give you the same test again, or a very similar test, doesn't have to be exactly the same, Today I ask you 5 plus 8, and in 3 weeks I ask you 9 plus 2, and whatever, they're different numbers, but the same level of skill. If you get a 95 on the test today, and in 3 months you get a 96, and in 6 months you get a 94, and in a year you get a 95, that's reliable, right? Because over time you are getting a very similar answer. And that shows that the test isn't broken. If I give you a test today and you get a 95, and I give you a test in 3 months and you get a 65, well, there's a huge problem. You didn't suddenly forget how to add and subtract in 3 months. The problem is the test. Now, those are very obvious examples with such a simple test and such a big difference. But this idea of reliability asks the question, over time, will people get approximately the same answers or the same scores on similar tests? If I give you an honesty test today and you get an 85 on this honesty test, and 3 months later you get a 70, something's wrong. Either you have become dishonest or that second version of the test was not reliable. So when we talk about reliability, we're talking about over time when people take a test or take similar tests, are they going to get similar results? That's reliability, and we'll talk about this more. Validity. Validity is a little bit different. Validity asks this question: does the test predict what it intends to predict? So let's say I give you an honesty test, and you get a 99. And then 3 months later, a bunch of your coworkers come to my HR office and they say, David, this guy, he lies all the time. He steals things from the break room. He steals food from the refrigerator. He told us he had a new customer and he was lying. And I look back and I say, but he got a 99 on the honesty test. Well, maybe you're able to get a good grade on that test because the questions were easy. Would you steal people's food? Yes or no? You circle no. Would you steal a customer? You circle no. It's super easy to pass that test, but it's not valid because it doesn't actually predict what it's meant to predict. So typically the SATs are a good example, like those kind of standard school tests. If you took the SATs, one day, now of course people study very hard to take them, so there is a variation whether you're studying or not, or an IQ test is another example. If you take an IQ test today and take it again 3 months later, you should get approximately the same score. And if you get a very high score, it has been shown that those people are better at those skills. I will not say smarter, because intelligence is not the only thing measured. Different IQ tests measure different things. And we actually will talk about that when we talk about IQ tests a little later in this subject. I'm pretty sure, yeah, when we talk about cognitive tests, there are many different kinds of intelligence, which is very important for us to understand in HR. That IQ is one kind of intelligence. There's like 9 different kinds. So, validity and reliability. As I said, let's talk about reliability first. So, reliability, another word for this would be consistency. Is a test consistent? Do you get the same scores approximately by the same person when retested with an identical or similar test? If I give you a test today and I give you a similar or equivalent test in 3 months or 6 months, will you get a consistent score? Now, the way to do this would be like an internal comparison estimate. And that says we have more than one question that asks the same thing. So if you've ever taken a personality test, and I will ask you, oh, come on, straight line. I will ask you to take the Myers-Briggs personality inventory, the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI. I will ask you to take that as part of your homework. And even if you haven't before, I'd like you to do it again. So when you take a personality test, let's say that the test is asking you about whether you're extroverted or introverted. There might be a question that says, when I go to a party, and usually these questions are like strongly disagree, agree, strongly agree, like those kind of, it's a range, it's not yes or no. So if the test asked, if I go to a party, I enjoy meeting new people. Strongly disagree, somewhat disagree, agree, somewhat agree, strongly agree, and you choose one. And another question says, if I go to a party, my favorite thing is to talk to people I don't know. And another question says, when I go to a party, I often stand in the corner. And another question says, when I go to meet friends, I always talk to people I don't know first. It's going to ask the same question again and again and again in slightly different ways. And a lot of people wonder when they take the test, why do they keep asking the same question? And the reason is they want an internal comparison estimate. So if you take this test and it says, when I go to a party, I love to meet new people, and you write strongly agree. Now for another question that says, when I go to a new city, I enjoy joining clubs and meeting new people. Are you going to write strongly agree to that also? Because it's a very similar idea. Or a question that says, when I go to parties on a Saturday night, I would much rather be out with people than in watching my favorite movie. Are you going to write strongly agree for that? Because all of these questions are really asking the same thing in a different way. Now, if you wrote strongly agree to one question, strongly disagree to another, and somewhat agree to the third, the problem isn't you. The problem is these questions. They're not asking the right thing the right way. If they're trying to ask about, are you extroverted? They're not really asking it in the right way. So there's this idea of a test being reliable, and also the idea of the questions on the test being reliable. The way we determine if the test is reliable is with a retest estimate or an equivalent form estimate. With retest, we take the same test and we give it to the same people at different times. So I'm going to give you this honesty test or IQ test or skill test or whatever it is. I'm going to give you a test today, then I'm going to give you the same test 3 months later or 1 month later, 6 months later, and just make sure that you did approximately the same both times. Equivalent form test, same thing, but I don't give you the same test. I give a test to some people, and then I give a different but very similar test to the same people. So it's still the same people, different times, but whether it's the same test or a similar test is the only difference, right? Whether it's equivalent test or a retest. And that's really how we determine reliability. What does that mean? That means it takes time. There really is no way to determine the reliability of a test right now, today. You need time. And therefore, a lot of tests in HR you can buy them. Like the Rorschach test. You can actually contact a testing company that will send out a professional tester to your company and administer the Rorschach test. Because this test has been proven to be reliable over time. And there are many, many tests that you can buy in HR, whether you buy the test or you actually hire someone to come and administer the test. There's lots of tests that have been proven over time. Next is validity. And that, as we said, asks a different question. Not would people get the same score on the same test, but does the test measure what it's supposed to measure? So I could give you a test. Let's say I give you an IQ test, and today you get a 135. I think that's very good. I'm not sure. So you get a 135, and I give it to you again in 2 months, and you also get a 136. I give it to you again in 3 months. You get a 134. Okay, the test is reliable because each time I give you the test, you get a similar grade. And the next question is, I'm testing you for IQ, and you're working in a company, in my company, where I need people to be smart and analyze, research. Does this test prove you can do the job? Because maybe you have a very high IQ, but you're terrible at this job. If I give you an IQ test to work in my company that plants trees, we go to deforested areas and we plant trees and plant flowers, is that IQ test useful? No, not at all. You could be a genius, so what? It doesn't really have anything to do with this job. And by the same logic, I could give you a strength test to work in my company where you sit at a desk and do research all day. They're not related to each other. Now, if I give you that strength test today and 3 months later and 3 months later, I'm going to get the same results pretty much. You can lift 20 pounds today, and maybe next time you can lift 25, and next time you can lift 20. But does that help you do research? No. So we need to know if the test is valid. Does it predict what it's supposed to predict? And this gives us a sense not of consistency, but of confidence. So with reliability, we're talking about consistency. With validity, we're talking about confidence. Can I be confident that if someone does well on this test, that means they will do well on the job? In 1978, the Uniform Guideline on Employee Selection Procedures was adopted. We didn't really talk about this in our law class because it's not really relevant for discrimination. But the purpose of this particular law was to create a framework for using tests in order to make sure they test what they're supposed to test. And it did have to do with disparate impact. I mean, now we understand that idea of disparate impact versus disparate effect. And we understand that there's a problem with just giving tests to people. Because let's say I don't want women to work in my company, and so I give everybody a strength test, a pull-up test, knowing that most men are more likely to pass this than women. Maybe not as much anymore, but in 1978, to be sure. Or I give a university-level test where if you didn't go to university, you'll never really pass this test, knowing that in the area where I live, only one racial group really went mostly to university. And it's like, that's really racist, even though I'm using what appears to be a very valid test. It's not valid, it's not relevant to the job. And we saw in I think it was last week, we talked about a moot court case, giving a test that said, or a requirement that said you needed to go to high school in order to do a job shoveling coal. And the question was, is that in violation of Title VII? And of course it was, because going to high school is not related to shoveling coal, even though the company tried to make an argument. So how do we know if a test tests what it's supposed to test? Well, number one, is it related to the job? If I give you a strength test for a research job, that's not related. If I give you a research test for a strength job, like planting trees, that's not related. So it has to be related to the job. And then second, we need evidence. We need evidence that this test is an indicator. And that is why HR often does buy a test. a proven test, like an honesty test or an integrity test or a loyalty test. There are lots of tests that can be bought, and they just send them to the company with either a professional comes to administer the test or just instructions for how we do it, and then instructions for how we score it or grade it. Sometimes you just send it back to the company and they will grade it for us. But we need some kind of evidence. Of course, we need a job analysis first, so we know what we're testing for. Then we need to identify which tools will help us find the people who meet the job requirements. And then we need what's called a validation report. Because people could say, hey, you know, you didn't hire me. And we would say, well, yeah, you didn't do well on our Rorschach test of this picture of ink. And you would say, well, how do you know what doing well means? What does doing well mean for a test about looking at ink blots? So we need some sort of validation report. There are three kinds of validity: criterion, content, and construct, that we need to know. So the first, criterion. Criterion validity says that people who do well on the test do well on the job. And people who do poorly on the test do poorly on the job. That's the criterion. Because the criteria of our test is it tests to see if you'll do well on the job. So if this is a research job, if we give you this test and you get a high grade, we expect you to be very good at research. For a legal test, if you get a high grade on this law test, like the bar exam, we expect you to be a good lawyer. We expect you to do well on the job. So the test is the measurement of job performance. You do well on the test, you do well on the job. You do well on the test, you do well on the job. You do bad on the test, you do bad on the job. You do well on the test, you do well on the job. Okay, so in this, there would be a statistical relationship over time between people who did well on this test and well on this job. So that's criterion, and that probably is the most important measure of validity. We have to have evidence that it actually does predict. If you do well on the test, you do well on the job. It has to be real. And because of that, actually getting this kind of validity can be a long and expensive process. Because we need to give people tests and then have them do the job for 6 months or a year, and then see, okay, now we have 6 months or a year of performance criteria. How did this person really do in their sales job? Now let's look back on their sales test. Uh-oh, they got a 95 on the test but are doing bad at the job. Or uh-oh, they got a 35 on the test, are doing great on the job. Or fantastic, they got a 95 on the test and they're doing great at the job. But that took us 6 months or a year just for one group of people who took the test. To really identify if a test is valid, it's going to take us years. And that is, again, the reason that HR often buys tests that have been already proven, that have evidence that they are valid. So you might have a study that says that college grads perform better than high school grads as financial advisors, measured by the amount of money they make in their investments over a 1-year term. Now, that's going to take 1 year to do this study. So you would give them a test, and then you would have to wait a year to see how they actually did. And then if you want to compare that again, you would have to wait another year for another group. We're talking, many of these tests really do take 5 to 10 years for reliability and validity. The next kind of validity is content. So content says that the actual content of the test, the questions, the skills, the strength, whatever, that is actually part of a particular job. You have to show, if I'm giving you a typing test, I have to show that the job itself has typing. If I'm giving you a filing test, I have to show that the job has filing. If I'm giving you a strength test, I have to show that the job has strength. If I'm giving you an IQ test, I have to show that the job involves that kind of critical thinking. So is an aspect of the job performance related to the content of the test? Next and finally is construct validity. And this says, With construct validity, and this is the hardest to establish, is there a relationship between an underlying human trait and successful job performance? So what's a human trait and job performance? A human trait could be honesty, integrity, loyalty, friendliness, punctuality, a sense of duty, emotional stability, openness to new experience. These are traits, which means they're part of your personality. They're not typing, they're not memorizing. If I say like, okay, I'm gonna give you, I once took a test, this was for a government job, and they gave us a long string of numbers. You had 2 seconds to look at the numbers and then say as many as you remember. Like 5, 1, 3, 8, 7, 6. You just have to memorize numbers as fast as you can. Now that's not a personality trait. That's an ability. I mean, you could say it's a skill. People can get better at it, but it's an ability. Some people have the ability to look at a string of numbers and in their head separate them into like 4 numbers, 4 numbers, 4 numbers, 4 numbers, 4 numbers, and just memorize them. Some people can do it. Other people see a group of numbers and just memorize the first 2 and then get lost. You know, those are abilities, but they're not personality traits. That's not going to tell me anything about your personality. So with personality traits, of course, that is pretty much the hardest thing to test. How do we test for honesty? How do we test for integrity or loyalty or dutifulness or conscientiousness? You know, things that are really critical in a lot of jobs, but how do we test for that? And that's hard. So, you know, we don't talk about that as much. So with validating these tests, we already did our job analysis. We're going to choose our test, whether we make the test or we buy the test. Then we administer the test. Then we look at the scores. And then we're going to cross-validate, revalidate. We maybe give the test to another group of people, give the test again in 3 months. We can't just give it once. Once we create a test, we're going to have to give it again and again. So these steps. First of all, we analyze the job. Let's go through these steps, and then maybe let's take a break, since there's still quite a bit to do, and that will get us to about an hour. So let's analyze the job first. Now, we talked about that last week. That is the job analysis, the job description, the job specification, the job requirements matrix, and the competency model. Those 4 things, when I say job analysis, that's what I mean. Job description, job specification, job requirements matrix, competency model. That's what I'm talking about. Then we choose the tests. And we are going to talk about a variety of different tests in our next video. And we combine them into what's called a battery. Generally, in companies, we have more than one test. We might have a typing test and a dexterity test and a IQ test, and we might have a bunch of different tests, and that's called a battery of tests. Then we will administer the tests. So we might want to use predictive validation, which means we're trying to predict. We're trying to predict how people will do before they actually take the test. Then we will give people the test. Really, we're talking about pre-employment, so this is before they are hired. And then after they've been working for some time, we give them the test again in order to validate. We're going to measure their job performance during the job, and we'll compare it to the earlier test they took. And this will show us whether or not we have criterion or criteria validity. Did the test predict the job? You do well on the test, you do well on the job, you do bad on the test, you do bad on the job. Well on the test, well on the job. Bad on the test, bad on the job. That's criteria validity. We relate the scores, right? We see if there's a significant relationship or an insignificant relationship. Maybe we do it ourselves in the HR department. Maybe we send it out to the test company to have them do it. And we will use some sort of correlation analysis, some sort of statistical analysis to see where did the range of people who got this score on the test have this performance level on the job. And then finally, we'll do this again, step 3 and 4, again and again over time to make sure that these tests are valid. Obviously, if we get a good test that actually proves if someone can do the job well, that's worth its weight in gold to us. That's amazing. If we have a test that we can give applicants, and if they get a good score on the test, then they're probably going to do well on the job. I mean, that's it. We want that so much. So this isn't a small thing. Okay, let's take a break there. We're exactly at 1 hour, and then we'll come back and do the second video in a little bit.